Hello,
Hello.
welcome. As you know, you're in the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle. Thank you for coming out to our meeting today. I'm Maura Bright. I'm a member of the board. Just a quick blurb to tell you who we are, and then I'll go on to other things. The Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle promotes the use of reason and science in the search for and commitment to living an ethical life that benefits all humanity. We believe that personal inquiry, responsibility, and accountability are the best bases for ethical decision making. Our weekly forums seek to broaden our understanding of ethics and human nature, and our congregational community encourages us to share diverse opinions, friendship, and camaraderie. We welcome everyone to share in our journey. If you want to learn more information about our community, please let me know following the platform. We also have a visitor sign-in sheet and some literature. So just to start with, today's program is a little different than our normal program. We're not doing opening and closing words, because of time constraints and no joys and concerns. So save them up for next week. We'll be here live next week too. Instead, I would actually like to introduce the people instrumental in creating this program, as well as our other co-sponsors. So for Common Cause North Carolina, the person we've been working with most is Sailor Jones over here. And then, of course, Gino, Gino Nuzzolillo of the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. And we also have partners, which I've listed alphabetically as by their affiliation. We have the Carolina Jews for Justice, Marilyn Hartman and Ellie Hanna. And also one more, their lawyer over there, whose name I'm sorry, I forgot her name. What's her name? Her name is Jennifer. Okay. The Chapel Hill Carborough NAACP is also helping us out with this, and NC Counts. And with that, I'm actually going to turn the program over to the people who know what they're doing with it.
Hi, friends. How are you? Can everybody hear me all right? Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. All right. My name is Sailor Jones. I work for an organization called Common Cause North Carolina. Has anyone heard of that? Well, we'll be using, in addition to Moore v. Harper puns throughout this presentation, we'll be using some Common Cause references as well, since that is our common cause for the next year, is fighting Moore v. Harper. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. This is our Orange County Map Our Future People Over Politics event, where we'll be talking about Moore v. Harper. And how many of you have heard of Moore v. Harper before and feel like you know a little bit about it? Okay, great. You serve for us. You serve for us. About a quarter of every group that we have spoken to over the past month have known about Moore v. Harper. So I expect no less from Orange County that maybe a few more people in the audience will, and maybe as a little bit of time passed, you may have seen a little bit about Moore v. Harper. Can people shout out how they learned about Moore v. Harper? Newspaper. Yes, ma'am. Noted. We'll include a nice link on those future ones as well. Anyone else? Online. Okay. So the media has done a pretty good job of educating folks about Moore v. Harper at this point. When we went to the Harnett County event, which was our first teaser event, it was the Washington Post. It had been their local paper in some cases. And it had been MSNBC that day, where some attorneys for the case had been talking a little bit about it. And we were lucky enough to walk into that crowd of people who said, and I quote, Moore v. Harper is twisting our heads into pretzels, is what the audience in Harnett said. So we're going to try to unravel those pretzel heads here today and give you a little bit more information about this. But we are here to talk about Moore v. Harper, which is the latest North Carolina redistricting case to go to the Supreme Court. We actually have someone here today who has fought some of those, and Allison Riggs. So we'll hear from her in just one second. But it's also a little bit bigger than any redistricting case that Allison has fought at the Supreme Court and that we have experienced, in that it is based on a fringe and radical idea pushed by a handful of politicians that believe that the Constitution should read so that state legislatures and legislators have absolute power over things like redistricting congressional maps or federal elections. And so this is a little bit different than we have seen. It has implications for North Carolina, obviously, because it is a North Carolina case pushed by North Carolina's legislators, but it also has national implications. And that's why we brought in the big guns and Allison Riggs, because we will need to fight this with everything we've got. And that is why we're here today, okay? We are kicking off a statewide tour this month to go to 100 counties and talk to everyone who will listen about Moore v. Harper. In fact, we're trying, much like we did with Amendment 1, House Bill 2, voter ID, you name it, trying to seed hundreds of thousands of conversations. So first and foremost, we'll be educating you about how to talk about Moore v. Harper as you learn about Moore v. Harper. How's that sound? Okay, great. I'm glad we had this talk. We're also trying to build a sense of urgency around Moore v. Harper. Let's let everybody know that Moore v. Harper is on the ballot in 2022, because when it comes down to it, state lawmakers who exist right now and who are on the ballot want to take away powers from state court judges who are also on the ballot. And so therefore, Moore v. Harper is on the ballot. And that means you have control over Moore v. Harper. And so we're glad to have Allison here, who has control over the litigation side, but you too have a role to play in this beyond talking, and that is voting. We're going to talk a little bit about that. The last thing I want to say about Moore v. Harper before I do turn it over to Allison to tell us a little bit about how we got here in terms of the history of this case and how it's the culmination of a 10-year power grab and an effort by state lawmakers to delegitimize the courts. But we also want to let you know we are building a movement very similar to some of the other movements you've seen in the great state of North Carolina over the past decades to push back against these efforts. And we are building that for 3 reasons, and I want to point them out to you right now. One, not only should you vote in 2022 and get everybody you know to vote in 2022, talking about Moore v. Harper along the way, but does anyone else know what happens in January after you vote? Anyone? What happens in North Carolina in January? Maybe you've repressed it. The long session, lawmakers will return for the legislative long session. The last long session was very long. It lasted 300 of 365 days, full of regressive legislation, and probably almost promise that we'll have more of that to come in this session as they anticipate this power grab going to the Supreme Court. The second thing I want to tell you about is we'll also be redistricting next year, because the congressional maps are interim maps, meaning we will redistrict again in 2023. So we are building a movement that not only pushes back against whatever comes at the General Assembly, that prepares for redistricting, and that means public comment and storming the castle at the People's House as much as we need to get the fair maps we need. But we are also building a movement of hundreds of thousands of new people brought to the fold by this fight to prepare for what happens after 2023. Anyone? 2024. It's Sunday. I'm trying to make this easy on everyone. And I bet you know what happens in 2024. I don't even need to say more words. Okay. So the last thing I want to say is that this is a space for education, engagement, and mobilization. Feel free to tweet what you see. Feel free to share what you hear. Okay. And this is an opportunity for us to be in a nonpartisan space, because this is so extreme. It impacts every single political party you can imagine, and those not affiliated with political parties in the state, a third of registered voters. But it also centers racial justice. We know racially gerrymandered maps and racially discriminatory voting laws are what got us here. It is a fusion movement in the great state of North Carolina that's going to dig us out. This would normally be the part where I say amen, but I'm not going to do that today. Okay. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to my good friend Allison Riggs to talk about a little bit about how we got here.
And Allison, we're going to have you come up. Thank you, Saylor. But I just wanted to really quick, one more time, honor the folks who are sponsoring this today. So Marilyn and Ellie, if you'd please stand up, from Carolina Jews for Justice. Thank you for being here. And y'all are going to hear a little bit more from them sooner and later on. Our wonderful tech wizard, Chris Kamen, if I'm saying that right. Thank you. Maura and Fred Bright for hosting us with the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle. That's right. Claps all around. And then you will hear from him a little bit later on, but Kyle Brazil at the North Carolina Counts Coalition is also joining us today. So I just wanted to thank all of y'all folks for having us. Now, without further ado, let's get into the actual content of why you're here. So Allison, you want to tell us how we got here?
Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here. It's nice to see you all. I'm Allison Riggs. I'm the co-executive director for programs and chief counsel for voting rights at the Southern Coalition for Social Justice. It's a mouthful, but I'm running on a lot of caffeine, so good to go. I just came home from DC last night where I was talking with some national folks about how do we keep up engagement and education and enthusiasm for redistricting between redistricting cycles. And I was like, well, I don't know what that is in North Carolina. We don't live that. We stay engaged because it happens every year. The history of redistricting fights in North Carolina is so long that, to Saylor's point, it implicates bad behavior by both political parties and a lack of willingness to listen to voters. But to focus in rather than give you a full lecture of the history of redistricting in North Carolina, it is important to understand that we ended up where we are today with Moore v. Harper starting last redistricting cycle. When the legislature redistricted in 2011, they packed Black voters into as few districts as possible, thus limiting their political power in what's called racial gerrymandering. So they drew the lines on the basis of race to hurt Black voters. We sued, we won in court, and they were ordered to draw new maps mid-decade. Hence why we're all so good at organizing around this right now. The legislature said, okay, if I'm not allowed to racially gerrymander, then I'm going to partisan gerrymander to the same effect. That is, to silencing voters who disagree with me, and cementing our power in the legislature. And so they drew some crazy maps for the state legislature and congressional districts and partisan gerrymandered. And on behalf of League of Women Voters and Common Cause, we took this case on the congressional districts all the way up to the US Supreme Court. I had the honor of arguing that case in 2019. And in essence, we said these maps are so unfair, so non-responsive, that it doesn't matter how much voters vote, how much they turn out, these are rigged districts. And in a 5-4 vote, the US Supreme Court said, sorry, there's nothing the federal courts can do about it. Chief Justice Roberts wrote for the majority. He was joined by the conservative justices, many of whom are still on the court. He said, look, partisan gerrymandering is really bad for democracy. I'll give you that. But there's political solutions. One thing you can do, the states are acting to do this. There's a lot of reform going on. There's state constitutions that provide protections, and state courts can handle that. So he said to me, he said to our clients, he said to Common Cause North Carolina, you lose this case, but don't worry, you can go to your state courts. Well, we took the court at its word that was an option for us. And we engaged in this redistricting cycle like we always do, advocating, going to public comment, telling the legislature what we wanted, and hoping that they would listen. That's not what happened, unfortunately, but that's how we go into every legislative session, is not necessarily trusting, but willing to engage in dialogue for fair representation. So we tried that late last year. Unfortunately, the legislature was non-responsive, didn't listen to us, and enacted some really partisan gerrymandered and racially discriminatory districts. On behalf of Common Cause, we sued in state court like we were instructed to by the US Supreme Court, and went all the way up to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And the North Carolina Supreme Court found that these maps were in fact partisan gerrymanders that violated 4 separate different parts of the North Carolina Constitution. They said, legislature, here you get a chance to fix it. The legislature squandered that chance when it came to the congressional map, and the court had to fix the map. Then suddenly the Republican leadership in the General Assembly said, well, wait a second. There's this thing called the independent state legislatures theory, and we'll talk more about it because it's a mouthful. But they said to the US Supreme Court, hey, US Supreme Court, the state courts aren't allowed to engage in reviewing congressional redistricting maps because only the state, under the US Constitution's elections clause, only the state legislatures get to do anything with respect to federal elections. This is when Saylor says this is radical and out there and not what we're used to. This is 100% accurate language she's using. So they appealed to the United States Supreme Court, who kept the court drawn fix in place for this year. And as Saylor mentioned, that's an interim map, but they took the case up on this question of, can state courts impose the demands of the state constitution, our most prized guiding document in the state that we value so highly? Can state courts do their job and enforce the state constitution? And that's what we're going to argue in front of the US Supreme Court in December of this year. So that's how we got to where we are. Hand it off to, I'll let the MC.
You'll be back. No worries. But just to talk to you a little bit about your maps and just to show you visually the maps that have brought us to the court, I'm going to invite Tyler Day up to talk to you a little bit about how your congressional maps have changed. I also want to mention we have how all your local maps have changed, but I ran paper, so you're going to get them online instead of in person here. So forgive me for that. But Tyler, you want to talk about?
Sure. I'm Tyler Day. I'm the Policy and Civic Engagement Manager for Common Cause NC. I'm going to talk about the congressional maps. And one of the things I really love about our democracy is our system of checks and balances. And back in November, as Allison said, the legislature did something out of whack. They drew these congressional districts, which were partisan gerrymanders, essentially. And this map, the red shows you districts that lean towards the Republicans, blue districts that lean to the Democrats. The darker the shading, the heavier that district leans. And it would have most likely, according to an analysis from Dave's Redistricting app, resulted in a 10-4 split among the congressional delegation. You can see many communities were split up. The Triad was split into 4 different congressional districts, and there were really many different problems with that map. But thankfully, the North Carolina Supreme Court, when we took this case to court, they did their job. They acted as a check on the legislature. They said, this goes too far. This is against the North Carolina Constitution. They said it was unconstitutional beyond a reasonable doubt, and that partisan gerrymandering violates the North Carolina Constitution. You can go ahead on. And so what they did after that is they had special masters draw the map. And this is the map that the special masters drew. The court appointed special masters. And this is not a perfect map, I don't think, but it is a better map. It is a map that is fairer you can go back. Yeah. And you can see the most likely seat allocation here would have been a 7-7 split. So much different from the 10-4 split. And this really, I think, shows you the difference between these two maps at an analytical level. This is using graphs that were developed from Dave's Redistricting app, and they measure different metrics of the map. So how competitive it is, the proportionality, the compactness of the map, and so forth. And I really want to point out the proportionality portion here, because what proportionality is measuring is how proportional are the maps. So if North Carolinians vote overwhelmingly, let's say, for Republicans to go to the North Carolina or to go to the U.S. Congress, we should have a majority of Republicans elected. But if the maps have been drawn in a way to insulate power, let's say the Democrats are in control, then maybe that doesn't happen. That would mean that it's not proportional. And in this instance, and I should note, these scores are out of 100. On the proportionality metric, the original maps drawn in November got an 11 out of 100, and meaning that they were skewed heavily toward the Republicans with that 10-4 split that you saw. The special master's plan got a 94 out of 100 on proportionality. So you really, I mean, that is a huge difference. You really can't get, much different than that. And lastly, these two graphs show you analysis from Plan Score on the partisan bias of the map. And this is the original plan on the left at a 14.7% partisan bias. You can see that is an outlier well to the right. And the map that was approved by special masters, again, appointed by the state court, had only a 0.9% partisan bias. So much closer to the middle. And so I just want to stress the reason why we got these better maps is because the state court appointed special masters. And under, if the legislature were to be successful in this case, it could threaten the ability for the state court to provide this crucial check on the legislative branch.
Thank you, Tyler. So let's recap real quick. State lawmakers in Raleigh drew unfair maps, right? And how many of y'all were part of the redistricting process this past fall? Raise your hand if you were. Read about it in the news, maybe you submitted testimony, did talk to your friends about it. A lot of y'all did. So a lot of y'all shared about what you wanted out of these maps. And did the folks in Raleigh give you what you wanted? Let me hear it a little bit louder. No. Okay. So they didn't give you what you want. So we took them to court. And we won. Historic victory in state Supreme Court. We even gave them another chance, like Allison said. Did they give you what you wanted at that point? No. So they had to have an expert come in and draw a map that was at least a little bit more responsive to what you all wanted. So what did you think lawmakers did again? They did I hear more bullshit? I love it. Just gotta be frank and honest about it. More bullshit. And that's what's at the US Supreme Court this fall. So let's just talk about this, and I'm gonna have Allison come up and tell you why we think we have a strong case to make at the court. We're not gonna spend a lot of time on this because it's not real, right? That doesn't mean it's not a threat to us, but it is not real in law. It's this crank theory known as the independent state legislature theory that wants state legislatures, like Saylor and Allison told you, to have supreme authority over voting and elections. Do you all want the fine folks in Raleigh to have supreme authority over your voting? Come on. I know it can be stronger than that. Do you want the state legislature in Raleigh to have supreme authority over how you choose who your representative is? That's right. But that's what they're trying to do. That's what they're trying to do. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the history and a little bit more about specifically what harms we could expect with this. But in the first place, we think we have a strong case when we go before the Supreme Court this fall. So Allison, you just want to tell us why we have a strong case before we go?
I think this is an important discussion to have because I know how disheartened folks were with some of the decisions coming from the Supreme Court recently. I certainly was disheartened when I argued the Rucho case and that decision came down. I know that folks who care about gun safety and reproductive justice were disheartened this spring, early summer with decisions that came down. But what I want to spend just a few minutes is acknowledging that and explaining to you why I think this is different. Because when we're defeated, when we give up, when we don't think there's any point to fight, to learn, to organize, then we lose. But when we fight together, we win. So this isn't a pep talk. I don't ask Gino or Saylor. I don't do cheerleader pep talk things. I'm standing here in front of you today as a litigator, as someone who's appeared in front of the US Supreme Court, as someone who's won and lost cases, and I'm telling you that I think the case here is good for a couple of reasons. One, this independent state legislatures theory would radically upset how state courts work, and not just in North Carolina, all across the country. When the framers wrote the Constitution, there were already when they wrote the US Constitution, there were already state constitutions and state courts in place. So they already knew that state courts were going to review state legislative acts for state constitutionality. And in fact, the state legislature is a creation of the North Carolina Constitution. The North Carolina Constitution is where it says all of the political power in the state flows from the people, and the people get to decide. And so the state legislature doesn't exist if there's not this document. So that's getting a little philosophical, but it's really important. And it makes this issue, I'm talking about it in terms of the North Carolina Constitution, but it makes it one that has broad partisan impact in a nonpartisan way, which is to say, it's going to impact Republicans and Democrats alike, or third parties. Red states, blue states, this is all going to dramatically undermine or change the role of state courts and state judges and providing a check and balance the way this whole government in this state, in any state, and in the US government, how checks and balances work. So I don't think the court, when it gets the full picture of how unsettling this is going to be for all of the states, will go there. Second is, like I mentioned Rucho, and I mentioned that Chief Justice Roberts told us, literally us, to go to state courts. Well, a lot of states took, and a lot of advocates took him at his word too, not just us, and they started changing their constitution to reform and protect against gerrymandering. Because they said, we can't go to federal court. Our only option is amending our state court. So states like Virginia and Ohio and New York and Michigan, these are folks who amended their constitution and imposed reforms on redistricting, including on congressional redistricting, and in reliance on that opinion. Now, I know that the court doesn't, they overturned Roe. I get that. But we're talking about the precedent and the structure of the government that's more than just 50 years. This is truly closer to 250 years, 230 years. And this is not something that's sort of the same sort of political issue. Not that I think reproductive rights should be a political issue, but this isn't that same kind of thing, because it really is about the very functioning of government and checks and balances. And so these are just a few of the reasons that we are very optimistic that we can make a case to the court that this isn't about Democrats versus Republicans. This is about responsive government, and one that the framers knew and understood, and no one wanted to take power out of the hands of judges to make sure that laws are constitutional. Because if that were the case, what would be the point of having a judiciary at all? So not putting my head in the sand, not being naively optimistic, really do believe that this court, with these justices, will understand when we make our case to them why this is wrong. It makes no sense. It's ahistorical, and it would be bad for American government generally. And I hope that you'll believe that. I'm happy to stick around and chat more if you doubt me, if you want to push me. I'm a litigator. I'm happy to argue. But it is important that folks don't give up, that we don't despair, that we recognize that the work is not done because a case is going to the US Supreme Court. There's still lots of ways for y'all to engage.
Thank you. All righty, my friends. So we are going to win, and we believe we are going to win. But I want to ground us a little bit more in why we are here and what is on the line, because we know we're going to win. We know the litigators in the court are going to do everything we can so that we can win. But part of how we win is this right here. It's us being in a room together to talk about this case, to have the resources to talk about it with the folks who aren't here, and to make Moore v. Harper, this wonky case about checks and balances, top of mind in every voter's mind as they go to the ballot box this fall. So I want to ask you all, forget elections for a moment. We'll get right back to it. But what issues are top of mind for y'all as you go to the ballot box this fall? Just shout them out. Theocratic fascism, reproductive justice. What else? Climate change. What else? Gun safety. Absolutely. What else?
Republicans.
Voting rights. Voting rights. The future of multiracial democracy, right? What else is on the line? Education. Let me hear one more. What else is on the line this fall? Healthcare. That's right. North Carolina is a place where we still haven't fully funded our schools. Ever heard of a little thing called Leandro? Right? North Carolina is a place where we haven't expanded Medicaid. North Carolina is a place where the Cape Fear River is poisoned. What's on the line in this case is not just about checks and balances, 200 years of precedent, or democracy. It is all the issues that depend on a functioning democracy. And that's what I want you to leave here remembering today, that if you remember, if you call it the ISLT or the BLT because you're hungry and it's a Sunday, even if you don't remember that, I want you to remember that that's what's on the line. And I want you to remember that this is not the first time we have faced a fight this dire. While at the same time we believe we will win, we have to be clear-eyed about reality. And we know that over the last 12 years and over the last 200 years of this country that we live in, and especially the state that we live in, we have fought against attack after attack after attack from this legislature. And every time we've been attacked, we fought back and we won. We showed up together, we fought together, and we won. You all know this. You've lived in this state. North Carolina is the only state in the South that doesn't have photo voter ID on the books. Because you showed up, you fought back, Allison took it to court, and we won. They tried to cut Sunday voting. They tried to cut your early voting. They tried to judicially gerrymander and rig your local judicial districts. And none of that happened because you showed up, you fought back, and you won. We're doing the same thing here. The point of us being here today is to share a little bit more about this case so that you can take it from here, so that the clubs you're a part of, the organizations you're affiliated with, all of the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle meetings from every Sunday here on out, you can talk about this case because these slides look great everywhere, right? They look great in book club. They look great in church if you do go to church, right? They look great everywhere. And so the task from us talking to you today is for you to take this content and bring it everywhere. All the resources that we're talking to you today with, you're going to get them. You're going to be able to use them as you want. And you're going to be able to talk about this case in the way that you want. So we just want to remind our history that we've been in this place before. We showed up, we fought back, we made our voices heard in every way. And even in 2020, with COVID and with all of the attacks by this legislature, we had record turnout in 2020, and we have to keep doing the same in 2022. So this is the core takeaway from this Moore v. Harper independent state legislature theory bullshit, right? As we learned, is that in North Carolina, we know that more means more for a few and less for the rest of us. That is the culmination, it is the power grab of all power grabs, the ultimate power grab, designed to erode faith in our courts, to restrict our votes, to potentially cast doubt on our election results, and to draw rigged districts that are not responsive to you. I mean, isn't it great that your chief litigator going to the court this fall, his last name is Riggs, and she spends her whole life fighting rigged districts? I just think that's kind of fun. So it's time to fight back and put people over politics, right? And I'm not gonna spend a lot of time on this, but to just let you know that this event in Orange County is one of many over the next year. We're not only going to every county in North Carolina, we're going across the country. Because believe it or not, folks in the Cornhusker state in Nebraska are scared about Moore v. Harper. People in California are scared about Moore v. Harper. Republicans in a place like California are scared about Moore v. Harper. Texas, they are scared about Moore v. Harper. Because anytime one party gets to have unilateral, unlimited, unchecked rule, that's worse for the rest of us, because it's people over politics. So this is not just about a Republican legislature and Democratic voters in a state like North Carolina. It's about all of us. And all of us have to respond to this challenge that upends the very basics, the schoolhouse rock you learned back in the 90s, right? So we're gonna go past this a little bit because you're already here, you're at the event, so you know the Map Our Future tour, right? So where do we go from here? You have to talk about this case. Taylor's gonna say it to you a million times. We have to talk and talk and talk. What are you gonna do after this? You're gonna talk. We're gonna seed 100,000 conversations about this case everywhere. And these are the 4 components of how we're doing it. One, it's a simple message. There's a lot of legalese in here that Allison spent many years in school to learn. We don't have that time in 3 months. So we're gonna make the harms, as we just talked about them here, very crystal clear. And then we're gonna paint the picture by sharing our own stories about why this matters to us and connect the dots to the key issues that you already named: education, healthcare, reproductive access. And then remind folks that when we fight together, we win. So when I'm done yapping in a few minutes, you're gonna hear from some of the folks who are here who are gonna connect you to the engagement, to the education, and the stuff happening here in Orange County that you can do next, because that's the most important part. When we're done talking, we got to start knocking, right? So I just want to go over one quick thing before I start to take it over, is I want y'all to understand specifically what might be at stake in North Carolina, because people are going to ask you, okay, theory, yeah, that sounds really bad, you're being real hyperbolic, but like specifically what kinds of things might happen if we were to be on the opposite side of this case. We know that more can make it even easier for state politicians to create barriers to voting access, draw rigged voting maps, and cast doubt on fair elected results. But that could mean widespread purges of the voting rolls. There are a lot of bad actors in this state who are trying to force your county board of elections to purge voters from the voting rolls unjustifiably, unfairly. And they are trying that all throughout this state. And the state legislature tries to do it too. So that's on the line. Cuts to popular early voting options. North Carolinians vote early. The vast majority of North Carolinians vote early. And not only do you get to go vote early, you can register at that early voting site if you haven't before, or change your address if you moved in the last year. That's on the line. Voter ID policies that are an unnecessary barrier that add time and cost, especially for working voters, especially for rural voters, that make it even more difficult, put up another barrier to the ballot box. And we know that with every little barrier put in place, that might mean 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 or 15 people don't go to the ballot box because they don't have the time to try to see if they have a birth certificate somewhere, right? They don't have the time to do that. They've got family to take care of. They've got kids to take care of. They've got jobs to do. And so every single barrier that might be put in place to keep people from voting is on the line with this case. And then finally, fewer protections against voter intimidation, right? We know that's a problem in this system. So the bottom line, if more succeeds when it comes to federal elections, legislators could violate our rights and state courts couldn't stop them. So when you're talking to folks, this is what is on the line. This is being clear-eyed about the reality that we face. And as I just told you, it's not about Democrats or Republicans. It's about what's right or wrong. It's about people over politics. Now, if I could just get this quick. So I want to go past this a little bit. I'm going to skip some slides. We also need to be connecting the dots to the issues that we care about. These are some North Carolina leaders on a couple different fronts from around this state who are talking about what this case means to them, why they even care about it, why they even showed up. Tara Romano at Pro-Choice North Carolina connects the dots between Moore v. Harper and the overturning of Roe v. Wade. I mean, did y'all hear the news just last week that the 20-week ban is back in place in North Carolina? Because that's the world we live in now, and that's what's on the line. And we know we have a legislature who is not very friendly to the reproductive access and abortion justice in this state. It's the same from Lamisha Whittington Kaminsky at the North Carolina Black Alliance. who talks about the fact that gerrymandered electeds, and in a world where Moore v. Harper's reality, even more gerrymandered districts mean that hundreds of thousands of dollars are going to politicians who represent areas that allow companies to pollute their communities, to pollute their waterways, places like Duplin and Sampson counties. Right. So I don't want to put you too much on the spot, Marilyn, but we can talk all day about this case and why it matters. And I can give you every beautiful sound and talking point in the world, but none of it matters as much as us talking to each other about personally why this matters to us and why we want to defeat it. So Marilyn, I might ask you if you'd be willing to just share really briefly why you even spent as much time with Saylor and I as you have to put this together and why this case matters to you. And feel free to come up here.
I'll be really brief because in a minute I'm also going to tell you ways that you can get involved. But basically, I'm just obsessed with democracy and voting rights. I'm not a professional. I leave that to Allison and Gino and Saylor, and many of you. But I've been volunteering for quite a while, and I volunteered with almost every organization around. And I'm finding voters are really energized, and I'm finding people really need to hear from us. So. That's it.
And it's as simple as that, Marilyn, right? But democracy is on the ballot this fall, and you want to save democracy. And I appreciate you sharing a little bit more. Now, why is this? Okay. So we're going to get to the final portion here to answer some questions that you all have, and then to hear from some of our partners that are here with us today about how you can get engaged. But the first thing that I want to make sure I mention before you leave today, did you all get sheets of this paper as you came in? If not, I think our good friend Caitlin might help us distribute them if you haven't gotten them. Because we're not letting you leave here empty-handed. You're going to get these documents. It's going to give you one page that summarizes everything we talked to you about today, in addition to the fact that you're going to get this slideshow. And then it's going to ask you to do some things next. Whether that's writing a letter to the editor, writing an opinion page, hosting your own event, and just taking our materials and running with them. It's going to ask you to do that next. And then finally, it's going to ask you to not only pledge to vote, but make sure you were registered to vote and ask about who you are bringing to the polls this fall. And if you'd be so kind and you want to stay in touch with us as this movement grows, as we rally in Raleigh in December around the oral arguments, we ask that this last page in which you put your name and email, that you return that to us if you want to keep hearing from Saylor and I. And I promise you might want to keep hearing from Saylor and I. We promise we won't spam you. But we want to make sure you have these resources before you go. Now, raise your hand if you're going to share these resources and talk about this case with your family, friends, and neighbors. Okay, I see. Oh yeah, I see that. It was going up a little bit. I'm glad every single person in this room is going to do that, because that is the only way that we beat this back. Final thing I'll say before I turn it over to our friends. Once again, all these resources are going to be online for you. You're going to get it afterward. Part of sharing your email with me is to make sure I send this directly to you. So before you leave today and you want to hand that pledge back, find Saylor and I, and we'll collect it from you. But all to say, and then we'll get into this moment, all to say that this fall, we have races on the ballot in every single county in this state. We've got sheriffs on the ballot. We've got state house and state senate candidates on the ballot. And in the most nonpartisan way I can say, the state legislature, the difference between the state legislature having a supermajority of one party and not, is on the ballot. And the state Supreme Court, which could flip from one party to another, is also on the ballot. So that's where we're going from here. It's less than 80 days until election day. So now that we know more about this case, know more about what's at stake, we got to go talk to folks, and we got to organize, and we got to turn out this fall. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to start talking a little bit about the ways you can engage from here. I think I'm going to turn it to our friend Kyle Brazil at North Carolina Counts First, who's joining us online to just talk a little bit about the next steps from North Carolina Counts and ways you can engage with them if you are so interested. And Chris, should I put this in front of the computer? We'll just give it 1 second.
All right, I'm going to say a few words. Let me get a thumbs up when you can hear me, Gino.
I can start singing in the interim if you all want to. We can do a little karaoke already. And actually, while we're waiting, while we're getting that set up, let's actually go to Ellie and Maryland first to talk a little bit about Carolina Jews for Justice, and then we'll come back to North Carolina Counts. There you go.
So I'm Ellie. I am part of the steering committee for the Durham Orange County chapter for Carolina Jews for Justice. And we are a voice for Judaism in the progressive movement. And we're a progressive voice in Judaism. We sort of have a two-pronged approach where we try to funnel our base, the base of North Carolina Jews, into supporting organizations that are dedicated to social justice values that we as Jews feel are important. Things like equality and fairness and taking care of your neighbor. So that extends to us trying to support our partner organizations who are working towards immigrant rights, who are working for racial justice, environmental justice. And then the other prong of that is being a Jewish voice in the progressive movement. So the most recent issue that's near and dear to the hearts of many Jews in North Carolina, as well as non-Jews, is reproductive justice. That is a Jewish value, being able to allow a person who's giving birth to make choices about their own body is something that we as Jews feel is religiously important to us. So any kind of argument that it is a religiously grounded reason to deny abortion access to people who can give birth is only thinking of one religion. So that's the kind of thing that we're doing. We work a lot of funneling into partner organizations, but we also do a little bit of our own work. We're doing a lot of programming, educational programming. We have collaborated with the Poor People's Campaign and Fight for 15 to do food distributions to our neighbors across the state, but primarily in the Piedmont. And we have a lot of other sort of statewide voter rights and civic engagement related things that we're working on. And I think I'm going to hand that over to the voting rights hero of CJJ.
Thanks. So I just have a few minutes here that I just want to help you figure out other ways to get involved. As Ellie says, traditionally CJJ has been an organization where we funnel people into our trusted partner organizations. And so we have been doing that a lot. And this QR code is going to appear on the next 3 slides, is all the same QR code, to a list of these resources that also has live links to all of these resources. So wait, go back still a second. So we do have on our website, we have a voting rights action guide that we update every month with a list of all the nonpartisan volunteer opportunities that we find for North Carolina. So check that out. And we also, on our voting rights page, usually have a highlighted call to action, something we're asking people to do. Most recently, it was to get people to make comments to the State Board of Election about some proposed amendments that were passed, which was a good thing. So we try to keep people engaged. Democracy in North Carolina, there's one of our hero organizations. They've been doing a lot. They have recently created all kinds of new informational materials for voters if you want to get a hold of them. And You Can Vote has their own pledge to vote, maybe similar to one SCSJ does. And they have also an online voter guide, everything you need to know about elections and how different ways to vote. And they have also informational materials. So that's, go on to the next slide. If you know, this has been mentioned a couple times already, we need poll workers. There are poll worker shortages all over the country. And when I've seen lists of states that are particularly in need of them, North Carolina is on the list. So I don't, Durham, I live in Durham County usually doesn't have a problem. I'm not sure about Orange County, but other counties across the state and where you're going to be going. So, and you could be actually a student election assistant if you're 17 years old. So consider signing up for that. And Democracy in North Carolina runs their Vote Protector program. They try to have people on the ground at polling sites around the state, so make sure voters are not turned away and are able to cast a ballot. And they also run the voter protection hotline, which Allison has been a part of for years. So CJJ, as I said, we usually channel folks to other organizations, but we are starting to do some of our own things. We're having an AMA event, which I just learned what that means. Uh, And guess who's the me? So I'm going to be partnering with Lisa Garcia Sampson, who's the executive director of the Unitarian Social Justice Group, UU Justice, North Carolina. And so we have a webinar in September, middle September for that. And then we're also together also with UU Justice are going to be setting up a series of 8 weekly phone banks on Thursday evenings, starting September 15th. And we're really going to, I put those bullet points to really emphasize if you're new, skeptical, or nervous about phone banking, we're going to try to make this as friendly and as we can. We're also going to be holding an online GoTV Shabbat right before, I guess, at the beginning of the second day of early voting to final call to action, pull people together. And one more slide, I think. So these are just a list of organizations, some of our partner organizations. Our phone banks are going to be organized with a New North Carolina project, I believe. And but you also can engage with him in lots of other different ways, as well as registering voters. You can vote in more than 40 counties in our state. And Center for Common Ground, they have a program called Reclaim Our Vote. They reach out to voters of color, and they have a postcard campaign now, and soon we'll have phone banking. So yes, that's all I have.
Oh, yeah. That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that. All right, round of applause for both of those. Now, y'all can't claim we didn't leave without telling you 65 ways you could get involved, right? Say it again. Yes. So one more person we're going to have speak to you to talk to you about other ways you can engage. If y'all ever thought that maybe it should be the people in this room who draw voting maps and not the folks in Raleigh, Kyle's going to tell you about the movement to win that in North Carolina, the Independent Redistricting Commission. So Kyle, we're going to turn it to you.
Absolutely, Gino. Can I get a thumbs up just to make sure everybody in the room can hear me okay? Just want to make sure I'm not talking into the black hole of the ethers. Can you all hear me?
No. 1 second, Kyle.
Can you all hear me okay? I'm talking.
Mike doesn't seem to be picking it up. Try hovering it over
Can you all hear me? Can you all hear me okay? I'm talking. I am talking.
Yes.
All right, good. You can hear me?
Yes.
Awesome, wonderful. Thank you all so much. I think you're back on the NC Count slide. You all, my name is Kyle Brazil. I'm the Director of Civic Engagement over at NC Counts Coalition. You all see that slide up there. I think I see the slide up there. We're a nonprofit org committed to building a healthy, just, and equitable North Carolina through cross-sector partnerships. I want to tell you all a little bit about what we're doing in this space and the continued emphasis of the organization. But as Gino said, right, we've got to vote, and this is about our representative democracy. And there's several pillars for our work, but we have focused in on the census work and the redistricting work, right? So for census, that's the information that we have. And we know that we can't, figure out what does it mean to have a representative democracy without knowing the numbers of the state and looking at those trends. All of this plays together. And so it's often crucial for us to do one before the other, as we know through our Constitution, right? And so for that census work, what we know, as just an example for North Carolina, we know we have about 1 million more folks in the state. The reason why we've moved from 13 congressional districts to 14 is that the state has increased in size and population. But in addition to that, we know trends that, throughout the state, if you look at the urban areas are continuing to grow. The rural areas are continuing to decline in population. We also know that our state is becoming far more diverse. And so in a place like Orange County, for example, right, we saw just a slight growth of about 10, 15,000 folks in population, about a flat line, if you will, for folks in African-American community, and for those who identified as white alone between the 10 years of 2010 and 2020 census, but a huge increase in American Indian, population of about 50%, Asian population of about 40 or so percent, and our Latinx community of about 43%. So I say all that to set the stage, right? This is about representative democracy, and this is about fighting for and dreaming for the nation we want to have. And so our ongoing census advocacy work, we are fighting to continue to have those relationships with the county, with the local city government, and we encourage you all to familiarize yourself with the local census data, with that information. We are promoting full funding. One of the things that we saw with the 2020 census is that we did not get full funding throughout the state. We maybe could have counted even more people and had, this significant undercount, which we did have an undercount in the last census. Maybe we could have chipped away if there was full funding. And then we also want to advocate for effective questions. And as you know, a part of this work, a part of building out equity and making sure this democracy represents all of us is making sure that these questions reflect, right, our communities, our population, because the data we get from the census then carries out for 10 years. It's connected to the funding that comes from the federal government and a whole lot of other things. And so one area of importance for us is continued census advocacy. Another stream of importance for us, you all, and on the next slide, is our work around redistricting. We were honored to help set the table and bring folks together to talk about redistricting and work through what we needed to do, to make sure our folks understood it, learned it, got the education, and then advocated for themselves and for their communities. Redistricting work is ongoing, not just because, right, Allison has to be in the courtroom every other year, probably every year around redistricting, but we also know that we have the 2023 redraw. There is a lot of work still going on. And so our roundtable is comprised of partners and coalition members from across the state getting together and right now mapping out the strategy and the plan so that we can push go when it's time to start the next redistricting cycle. For example, in that last cycle, we saw the fact that there were not hearings in every county, right? We sort of got hearings in almost all the parts of the state, but then some of those hearings, folks didn't know they were happening until a few days before, and they switched locations or provided bad information, right? And so we are working to make sure that when it is time to do that 2023 redraw rather, and if there's any other redraws in the future, we are ready. We can equip our advocates to provide testimony during the hearings and to speak up and to be engaged. And so that's the education and comms group. Another section of it is our prison gerrymandering group, which is seeking an end to prison gerrymandering in North Carolina. Prison gerrymandering is very similar to gerrymandering. It's just looking at the fact that so many of our incarcerated prisoners sometimes are mapped and grouped in the rural places where they are incarcerated, not in their home communities. And so it is fair, it makes more sense for those individuals to be placed for census, for redistricting purposes, where they are from. We're also looking at creating a local playbook so that we can hand that to folks locally and say, this is what you all can do, depending on what you all see on the ground, this is how you can affect change locally. And then the last thing I'll just talk on really quickly is the Independent Redistricting Commission work. It's a great work group that has come together around this idea that North Carolinians are sick and tired of gerrymandering, right? Close to 89% of all voters have said they oppose gerrymandering, they're tired of it. Litigation costs, it's millions and millions of dollars per cycle. And so in our minds, this is the way we can switch from playing defense, right? We are a defensive powerhouse, just like UNC Chapel Hill often is, go Tar Heel, sorry, Gino. We are that defensive powerhouse. This is an opportunity to switch and start playing offense. The time is right now. We have a lot of momentum around the people who are tired of gerrymandering. And so we're bringing a group together because folks are tired of it, and we're working for a bill focused on racial equity, which we could introduce in the spring of next year, in the spring of 23. You all, this is not the only way to do it, right? The way we do it in North Carolina is not the only way to do it. That lacks imagination. And there's a lot of states that do it differently. There's purely independent in California, and then there's a sort of this hybrid that we see in Virginia. We want to advocate for what's best for the people, right? Uncouple incumbent protection, right? So that the incumbents aren't preferred over the individuals. We also want to make sure that, folks' voices are heard. And so the common sense rules of making sure there's hearings throughout the state, that there's enough notice before the hearings, that the criteria makes sense, that legislators aren't in a back room drawing maps. This isn't 1920. And I picture, I'm from Chicago. There's, rooms of men smoking cigars, deciding where things are going to happen. This isn't 1920. We are past that, and this needs to be about the people. And so, you all, that's what we're advocating for. We're working on that right now. If you all are interested in any of this work or would like to get engaged, please email me. Please contact my colleague, Byron Laws, over at NC Counts. We're super excited about that. And again, make sure you vote, but also make sure you take advantage and get involved with the census work as well as the redistricting. All these pieces fit so we can have our representative democracy. Gino, I'm sorry I took too long. I'm going to pass it back to you. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Kyle. All right, y'all got to be sick of us. I promise we're going to end it here. It's only been about an hour. Can you believe it? Think about how much you learned in the last hour. So, next steps from here. Raise your hand if you're going to talk about this case. Raise your hand if you're going to engage in one of the ways you learned here or to keep engaging wherever you are. Raise your hand if you're going to register to vote or make sure others are registered to vote. And raise your hand if you're heading to the ballot box this fall. All right, folks, that's it. That's how we win. All right. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to the Ethical Humanist Society of the Triangle for hosting us. You've got more information on these slides from Chapel Hill, Carrboro, NAACP, and more. We're now going to open it up to questions, but we understand folks have to go. And you've got all these experts in the room to help answer your questions at this time. So with that, let's open up to questions, my friends.
If I drag in here, if you have a question, raise your hand. I'll bring the mic over to you. Aha, and we have one.
I think the name.
Allison?
Allison, yes. I know you're confident about winning the Supreme Court case. I'm not sure how confident I am about the Supreme Court justices, because it's not just 3 ugly faces, it's 6. But I mean, you're going on the basis of the Constitution and what's right. They aren't.
Or yeah, here I can make sure the speakers got. There you go.
I 100% understand that skepticism. I'll give you a stat too. Statistically, in sort of cases that go up on this posture, that go up where the Supreme Court agrees to hear it, the court below gets turned over about 3/4 of the time, but 1/4 of the time it doesn't. And this is the case that this is one of those cases that I believe is going to fall into that 25% bracket. I'm not going to stand here and argue with anyone about your feelings about the justices on the US Supreme Court. I understand those feelings are valid. That there are some things though that really strike at the heart of folks who even, may have strong political opinions when maybe we wish they didn't. This is so central to how our government functions and the idea of checks and balances. And quite frankly, there are some really typically conservative arguments that we might consider. That is, this is almost a 10th Amendment states' rights issue, right? So we know that resonates with some folks who are sort of politically conservative. The US Supreme Court, the federal government telling the states how they can structure their government, how they can create their checks and balances, that's something that, generally speaking, we hear a lot of folks who identify as politically conservative talking about. So I understand that, but this is a case that is going to be tried on the law. It is going to have impacts well beyond just gerrymandering. So this is not the partisan gerrymandering case. This is not a partisan case. This is not about gerrymandering alone. Folks talked with you about the all of the things that could be impacted if the elections clause is read this way. There's also a part of the Constitution called the Electors Clause that our case doesn't implicate it, but it's got some similar language. And no one wants to see what happened on January 6th happen again. And so I think that I am optimistically viewing some of the pushback of the threats and attacks on our democracy, but situated in the law. The law is on our side here. Has that always mattered? Absolutely not. But this is a situation, this is a case where I believe that what the court said in 2019 will hold the day and will continue to hold the day. It is, yes. The New York was forced to redraw its congressional maps based on their anti-partisan gerrymandering provisions in a way that went politically a different way than North Carolina did. But I think even more importantly is that this is not just about redistricting. It's a redistricting case, but it's about checks and balances and how our government is supposed to work. And our democracy has not always worked for everyone, right? We got to start there. Our democracy works when we fight for it, when we talk about what a multiracial, inclusive, participatory democracy really looks like. So we are living and breathing the fight for the democracy that we dream of, but it depends on checks and balances and no one extremist or rogue party being able to carry the day and silence the voices of voters.
Okay, question in the back.
This is for Allison as well. Can you speak to why you think the court took this case, given the recent history? 2019 is not a long time ago, especially not a long time ago for the Supreme Court. So why do you think that they took this case, given the very recent history?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and it's obviously one that we're never going to be privy to the answer to that. I think that there was a lot of discussion about this theory and how it related both under the Elections Clause and the Electors Clause in the 2020 election. So it's very well a chance to sort of provide some clarifying language that, that can be part of it. Or maybe they think that they thought there was some merit to it. Now they need to hear full briefing and fully from the parties, right? But ultimately, generally, the court then clarifies an issue and folks know how to proceed going forward under that. So I find it's hard to guess exactly why the court does what it does. Obviously, like, we're not privy to those insider discussions, but I do believe that for the reasons that I stated, that we can win this case, and we need folks to stay enthusiastic and believe with us and fight with us as we get ready for the Supreme Court argument.
Okay, we have this nice lady here, and then our president.
I'm wondering, what, if anything, do we know that of the actions that non-lawyers can take, ordinary people, in terms of rabble rousing and so forth? What has an influence? What kinds of actions seem in the past to have influenced the court, if anything?
So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. The court in DC, obviously, we don't vote for the justices. The president appoints and the Senate confirms. But here's the thing. We wouldn't be going to DC in December if folks weren't. So the answer may be, let's reframe the question. If we can't influence the folks in DC other than what the lawyers submit on the brief, I mean, we can still make ourselves heard, right? Do we know if that has a direct impact? We don't. We'll never know that. But here's why we're going to DC. We're going to DC because people were worried about the North Carolina Supreme Court enforcing the North Carolina Constitution. And we do get to vote on that. And there are 2 of the 7 seats up for election this November, and we get a direct say in that. And SCSJ is going to start providing information on the kinds of where you can find information, C3 compliant, where you can find information about the candidates, how you can talk about the importance of judicial elections. And by defending the ability of the North Carolina Supreme, we're defending the ability of the North Carolina Supreme Court to enforce the North Carolina Constitution. We need voters to to think about and ask themselves, who are the justices who are going to enforce the North Carolina Constitution? Because if we win and then it goes hand in hand, we need both. We're going to win both and we need both. But these are the kinds of things you should be asking yourself about the candidates, about the cases that they've considered and how they vote. Again, not telling you who to vote for, telling you to do the research, learn about the elections, and recognize that state court, right? We're in North Carolina, we're North Carolina voters, but state courts are on the ballot across the country and in some states in very, very, very important ways. And it's sort of like voter suppression, right? If your vote didn't matter, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to keep you from voting. If state courts didn't matter, they wouldn't be fighting so hard to take power away from state courts. So that's where I would take that frustration and refocus that energy.
I have a question.
Yes.
When the case is decided, when Moore v. Harper is decided, you've convinced us, I think, that you're going to win. All right. But it might not be a unanimous decision. Could I ask you to sort of lay out for us what you might see in the dissenting opinion? What are the arguments on the other side that they might use?
Sure. So, I mean, this is getting into the legalese, and folks maybe this is a better one-on-one conversation, but the arguments that the other side is making that would be embraced in a dissent is that in the Constitution, in the elections clause, it says that the power to regulate the time, place, and manner of federal elections is given to the state legislatures unless Congress acts. So they're going to say state legislature, not state courts, even though state courts already existed and judicial review already existed at the time the framers and founders wrote those words. So they knew about it. They weren't challenging it. And so you're likely to see that. And Congress can always act, right? We need to part of the reason why we fight so hard for fair and representative districts and is so that the House of Representatives can reflect the will of the people. And if we want some reforms and make clear that state legislatures can't do this, or they can't do that, or they have to do this, that we can go to our representatives in Washington, D.C. and ask for that. Again, I won't, be silly and say that we didn't try that. It didn't get hung up in the Senate so far. So the Senate remains a body in which voting reforms and voting access laws have gotten hung up. But if we have fair districts and fair congressional districts, we will keep pushing for good federal voting laws so that we don't have a patchwork system of justice, so that we don't have to solely rely on state courts and state constitutions, that the promise of a multiracial inclusive democracy will be the same for every single person living in this country. So that's some of what I expect to see. And it could delve into textualism versus originalism and get really wonky really quickly. Very interesting, but probably a little bit more than you want to dive into on a Sunday afternoon.
Okay, further questions? I kind of feel like no, we have one. They answered most of my questions before I had them, so.
I had a similar question, which was in talking about this case, the media usually connects it to January 6th. And we heard from those hearings that the Trump legal defense team thought that they had 2 votes in favor of potentially the coup. So I was just wondering, who do you think, or how many votes do you think would be in dissent?
Well, as someone who's going to, who practices in front of this court ethically, I have to be real careful about not speculating. I believe that this is the correct legal answer and that I can get a unanimous decision. Do I think it is? No, there's not a lot of unanimous decisions lately coming out of the US Supreme Court, but regardless, what I can tell you is that the US Supreme Court did not take up invitations to facilitate an overturning of the election in around the 2020 election. I know that's a for sure thing, and that's a good sign. And I know that this case, while under a different constitutional provision and not directly linked, I believe will result in the same leanings or the same outcomes. And I don't know what happened here.
Am I correct in thinking, it seems to me that if the Supreme Court was to rule in favor of this case, it would put into question their own power against ruling on the constitutionality of things that Congress might do. So you think they wouldn't want to turn away that power?
There's a lot of circular thinking and logic involved. I don't know that it necessarily impacts the US Supreme Court's review of Congress, but for example, the folks like Speaker Moore advancing this case also are the ones who used a racially gerrymandered legislature to put a voter ID constitutional amendment on the ballot. If they win in this case, then that voter ID constitutional amendment can't apply if the state legislature decides it doesn't want to apply to federal elections. So you start to spin in like they're almost arguing against the stuff that they've done, which to me reeks of desperation and is so illogical that it's part of where my optimism and hope derives. Is it's a last grab at power that doesn't really show any kind of logical and consistency, and it's just like what's going on here. I'm quite confused about the strategy, but regardless, I think we'll win the day. We'll win the day on voter ID. We'll win the day on other things. We'll keep fighting no matter what.
Okay, further questions? No? No hands? No hands. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming out to this program today.
Thank
Allison,
you all.
thank you so much.
Thank you all.
We do have a few refreshments on the side, just in case anybody wants a little something. Gino and Sailor are going to be starting the Zoom version of this for the next audience. Do you have a minute to say anything? Did you want to?
We'll just close it out by again saying thank you to all of y'all for being here. Once again, if you have that pledge card and you want to hand it to us on your way out, find either Caitlin, Sailor, or myself. And all the lovely folks will be around here. Sailor and I, unfortunately, we're going to go do the Zoom version of this event now. So fortunately, we're going to go do the Zoom version of this event. But thank you for being here, and we're grateful for it. Thanks, y'all. Righty.